The world's favorite drug isn't hidden in some laboratory. There's a good chance you've seen someone drink it today. Thousands of years before cafes and energy drinks, humans were already experimenting with plants that changed how they felt. Some plants fed you, some made you sick, but others did something much stranger. They helped you stay alert. Eventually, humans would become extremely familiar with this natural stimulant. Today, we call it caffeine. Humans didn't invent caffeine. Plants did, producing the chemical naturally long before humans started consuming it. Early people learned about plants through generations of observation, experience, and knowledge passed between communities. Imagine discovering a plant that seemed to make tiredness disappear for a while. That knowledge would be worth remembering. And here's the fascinating part. Different cultures discovered caffeine independently through completely different plants. In East Asia, tea became one of humanity's most important caffeine-containing drinks, with a history stretching back thousands of years. At some point, people learned that preparing certain leaves in hot water could produce something far more interesting than plain water. The result could taste bitter, but its effects mattered. People could feel more awake and attentive. Coffee has another story. Despite its modern popularity, reliable evidence for coffee drinking appears much later in human history. In Africa, coffee plants grew naturally, eventually becoming part of a completely new caffeine tradition. Centuries later, coffee drinking developed into a powerful cultural tradition and eventually began spreading far beyond its original regions. Tea and coffee weren't alone. Humans discovered caffeine in other plants too, sometimes thousands of kilometers apart. Across the ocean, people in the Americas discovered another stimulating plant, cacao, without knowing anything about tea or coffee. But this wasn't the sweet chocolate we know today. Cacao was prepared in very different ways by ancient American cultures. Here's the important question. If these plants could taste bitter, why did humans keep coming back to them? Because caffeine changes how tired you feel, temporarily helping many people feel more awake and alert. Caffeine works mainly by blocking adenosine receptors, interfering with one of the signals associated with increasing sleepiness. For someone facing work, travel, ceremonies, or long periods of activity, that temporary alertness could be valuable. Once communities valued these plants, knowledge about growing, preparing, and consuming them could spread between generations. Eventually, some useful plants weren't simply gathered from the wild. People began deliberately cultivating them. Tea eventually became deeply embedded in societies, developing traditions that went far beyond simply staying awake. Much later, coffee drinking became established around the Red Sea region before growing into something much larger. Coffee eventually moved beyond the home. Coffeehouses created places where people could drink, talk, exchange news, and socialize. Trade carried caffeine traditions across enormous distances, introducing coffee and tea to populations far from where they originated. Ships pushed that expansion even further, turning caffeinated drinks into increasingly global commodities. As demand increased, humans cultivated caffeine-producing plants on larger scales and moved them into new environments. Across different societies, caffeinated drinks could serve many roles: social, medicinal, ceremonial, practical, or simply enjoyable. Once caffeine crossed continents, something remarkable happened. Different cultures adopted it and created completely different traditions around the same stimulant. Tea traveled along trade networks for centuries, eventually becoming increasingly important far beyond the regions where its traditions developed. Coffee followed its own routes, spreading through trade and becoming increasingly popular across parts of the Middle East and Europe. When coffee became better known in Europe, this dark, bitter, and stimulating drink quickly attracted attention. For many people, caffeinated drinks eventually became part of daily routines, rather than something unusual or exotic. But caffeine wasn't just about fighting tiredness. Drinking it became connected with conversation, hospitality, work, and social life. Coffeehouses became gathering places where people could meet, exchange information, debate ideas, and hear the latest news. Meanwhile, tea developed its own elaborate customs, showing that humans had transformed a stimulating plant into something deeply cultural. As global demand exploded, enormous systems of cultivation and trade developed to keep caffeinated drinks flowing. Eventually, industrial processing made caffeinated-containing products easier to produce, transport, and sell on an enormous scale. Fast forward to today, and that ancient relationship with stimulating plants looks completely different. Coffee and tea remain major sources, but caffeine now appears in many drinks, foods, and other products. When caffeine reaches your brain, it blocks adenosine receptors, reducing some of the sleepy signals you would otherwise notice. Here's the catch. Caffeine doesn't magically manufacture energy. It mainly changes how strongly you perceive tiredness for a while. Eventually, caffeine's effects fade, and the tiredness it temporarily masked can become noticeable again. With regular caffeine use, people can develop tolerance, meaning the same amount may feel less noticeable over time. Part biology, part routine, part culture, for many people the experience surrounding the drink matters almost as much as the caffeine. Our ancestors experimented with useful plants. Today, we can get caffeine without even thinking about where those plants came from. And that's perhaps the strangest part. Different societies encountered caffeine through different plants, places, and traditions. Thousands of years of plant knowledge, trade, and culture eventually helped turn caffeine into the world's most widely consumed psychoactive substance. So tomorrow, when you see someone reaching for tea or coffee, remember, the story behind that little boost began with humans learning.
But caffeine has never affected everyone equally. Genetics, habits, and individual sensitivity can change how strongly people respond. Strangely, caffeine probably didn't evolve for us at all. For plants, the chemical can serve ecological functions of its own. Whatever caffeine was doing for plants, humans discovered something completely different. Consuming it could change how alert they felt. They didn't need laboratories or chemical formulas. They only needed observation, experimentation, memory, and knowledge passed between people. A useful discovery could become knowledge, where the plant grew, when to collect it, and how people prepared it. When that information survived across generations, a simple plant could gradually become part of a community's traditions. That's why asking who discovered caffeine has no simple answer. Different societies encountered different caffeine-containing plants independently. Tea developed across Asia through centuries of cultivation, preparation, experimentation, trade, and changing cultural traditions. Coffee's famous journey came much later, eventually connecting Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, Europe, and the wider world. And in the Americas, cacao developed within completely different societies, long before modern chocolate existed. Tea leaves, coffee beans, and cacao look completely different, yet all can naturally contain the molecule we call caffeine. Imagine living without knowing caffeine existed and suddenly noticing that one particular plant made staying alert feel easier. You wouldn't know the chemistry. You wouldn't need to. You'd simply remember that this plant did something unusual. Now jump forward through centuries of cultivation, trade, migration, and cultural exchange. The world around caffeine changed enormously, but one reason people value it remains remarkably familiar: feeling more awake. Today, countless daily routines around the world begin with caffeine-containing drinks. What began with humans learning the properties of plants eventually became an enormous global culture surrounding caffeinated drinks. Show this to an ancient plant gatherer, though, and the modern version might look completely ridiculous. Leaves, berries, roasting, processing, brewing, centuries of innovation now separate many consumers from the original plant. In a strange way, we're still participating in an experiment humans began generations ago, discovering what plants can do. The remarkable discovery wasn't caffeine as a molecule, it was recognizing that certain plants had effects worth remembering. That knowledge traveled through generations until science could finally explain some of what people had been experiencing. Observation became tradition. Tradition met trade. And eventually, science gave a chemical name to the stimulant inside those plants. So the world's most popular psychoactive drug wasn't invented in a laboratory. Humans found it growing in nature. And somehow, thousands of years of human curiosity ended up inside something as ordinary as a morning cup. Caffeine doesn't disappear the moment you stop feeling energized. Your body needs time to process it. That's why caffeine consumed later in the day can interfere with sleep for some people. Early consumers couldn't measure milligrams or read ingredient labels. They learned about stimulating plants through experience. Even the same kind of drink could vary depending on the plant, preparation, and amount used. And caffeine has limits. Increasing the amount doesn't guarantee better focus or better performance. The strangest twist is that caffeine evolved as part of plant biology, not because plants wanted humans awake. Plants are chemical factories, producing compounds that can influence insects, animals, and eventually curious humans. Generation after generation, people learned which plants were useful, which weren't, and which produced unusual effects. Once people valued particular plants, cultivation allowed communities to produce them more reliably. Cultivation transformed scattered wild resources into products that could support larger traditions and trading networks. Trade carried those products farther, connecting people who might never see the plants growing themselves. Eventually, a wild plant could become a crop, a drink, a commodity, and an everyday habit. Our ancient plant gatherer probably wouldn't recognize what thousands of years of human innovation eventually created. Yet hidden inside that modern cup is a chemical connection stretching all the way back to humanity's relationship with plants. Long before anyone could say caffeine, humans could recognize that certain plants made them feel different. Much later, chemistry gave scientists the tools to isolate caffeine and understand the substance behind those familiar effects. Ancient observation and modern science are separated by centuries, but they're chapters of the same human curiosity. It might have started with something incredibly ordinary, someone noticing that one particular plant was worth remembering. From that simple observation came cultivation, traditions, trade routes, coffeehouses, global industries, and countless morning routines. Ancient humans searched landscapes for useful plants. Modern humans sometimes search the kitchen before they've even fully opened their eyes. So, did humans discover caffeine, or did caffeine-producing plants quietly convince humans to carry them around the planet? Either way, one strange relationship between humans and plants became a habit that now spans much of the world. Here's the twist. Humanity's relationship with caffeine didn't begin with coffee. Other caffeinated plants had their own much older traditions. Tea has an exceptionally long history in China, although legends about its exact discovery are much harder to verify.
Like many ancient inventions, tea eventually gained colorful origin stories, but legend and archaeological evidence aren't always the same thing. Archaeology gives us clues through plant remains, chemical traces, containers, artwork, and written records from later periods. But archaeology usually can't identify the exact person who first tasted a plant and noticed something unusual. Whoever made that first connection probably disappeared from history without realizing their observation would matter centuries later. They didn't know about molecules, receptors, or stimulants. They only needed to recognize cause and effect. Eat or drink something, notice what happens, remember it. That simple process could produce extremely valuable knowledge. And knowledge becomes much more powerful when you can pass it to somebody else. Humans didn't have to rediscover everything individually. Useful information could accumulate across generations. Over generations, people could also experiment with preparation, changing how plants were dried, heated, mixed, or brewed. Preparation didn't just affect stimulation, it could transform aroma, bitterness, flavor, and the entire drinking experience. Eventually, consuming these plants could become something people did together, rather than simply for their chemical effects. Now, caffeine had another advantage. The drink itself created opportunities for conversation and social connection. At this point, humans weren't merely consuming a plant chemical, they were building traditions around it. And because different caffeine plants grew in different environments, geography helped determine which traditions developed where. That's what makes caffeine's history so fascinating. Humanity didn't necessarily discover it once. We encountered it again and again. Then, coffee's later expansion helped push caffeine consumption into another era of global trade and everyday routine. Over time, caffeinated drinks became associated with something extremely familiar: starting the day. Our ancestors searched for useful plants. Today, many people can get the same stimulant before they've properly woken up. Eventually, science transformed an ancient observation, "This plant makes me feel different," into something chemistry could actually study. And that's how humanity's curiosity about a few unusual plants eventually became one of the world's biggest everyday habits. The funniest part is that caffeine-producing plants never evolved their chemistry just to help sleepy humans start their mornings. Caffeine plays roles in plant ecology, interacting with insects and other organisms in ways completely unrelated to our morning routines. And then, one unusually curious species arrived, tasted these plants, remembered the effects, and eventually started cultivating them. Maybe the earliest encounters were accidental, but repeated observation could turn a strange experience into useful knowledge. Once someone recognized a useful effect, telling others meant the discovery no longer belonged to just one person. People disappeared, generations changed, but useful information could survive through teaching, tradition, and eventually writing. Once communities valued a particular plant, protecting access to it and producing more of it could become increasingly important. Humans began shaping landscapes around useful plants, turning naturally occurring resources into deliberately managed crops. Reliable cultivation meant more material could be harvested, processed, traded, and eventually consumed by far more people. What had once been local plant knowledge could now travel hundreds or thousands of kilometers through trade. Ships carried caffeinated products even farther, connecting distant societies through increasingly complicated networks of exchange. Wherever these drinks traveled, communities adapted preparation and serving traditions to their own tastes and customs. The stimulant might be chemically similar, but the human experience surrounding it could look completely different. Eventually, machines, factories, and global transportation pushed caffeine-containing products into an entirely different scale. Leaves and berries were transformed into standardized products that could travel farther and reach enormous numbers of consumers. Today, caffeine can feel so ordinary that it's easy to forget we're consuming a naturally occurring psychoactive substance. Tell our ancient plant gatherer what eventually happened, and he'd probably have several questions. We cultivated the plants, shipped them around the planet, built industries around them, and made them part of everyday life. For early consumers, finding the right plant could require local knowledge. Modern caffeine can require little more than reaching for a cup. A chemical produced naturally by plants became something humans cultivated, traded, ritualized, studied, and eventually consumed worldwide. Behind all that complexity lies something beautifully simple. Humans paid attention to what happened after interacting with plants. Curiosity turned observation into knowledge, knowledge into tradition, and tradition into something that could travel across generations. Eventually, that chain of human curiosity stretched from wild plants all the way to the modern morning routine. The container changed, the preparation changed, the culture changed, but humans kept coming back to caffeine. So, next time caffeine helps start someone's morning, remember there's an extraordinary human history hiding inside that ordinary cup.